Welcome to the American Theatre Wing seminars on working in the theater. These are taking place in the heart of Times Square at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. I think it's very fitting that this marvelous display of talent and information that the Wing is able to bring to you is right in New York City. There was an article by Harold Schoenberg in the New York Times that talked about the supermarket of the arts taking place here, and that people come from out of New York City into New York City, and it goes from here to the rest of the country. The Wing, as you know, does more than just have the Tony Awards. It's one of the oldest running organizations in the country. It started with the concept of sharing of knowledge and talent. It continues today. We share what we can possibly do in the theater with the people who can't come to the theater. We also stress quality. We bring live theater into public schools in New York City, into hospitals and institutions. The seminars have been going on for 7 years. We are very pleased and very proud of the response that we get from people who have seen it. And the audience is as filled with talent as our stage is. In fact, we have casts of Broadway shows sitting in, as well as students from New York University, City University, and the various universities of New York, and also dramatic schools around New York City. I'd like to thank Mr. Robert Isaacson, director of CUNY, the university's television network, which is also beaming this discussions into the CUNY college classrooms and his staff. I'd also like to thank our program director, Bill Riley, for assembling them. I will now turn this over to Henry Hughes, who is co-moderator along with Jean Dalrymple. Jean Dalrymple is a lady that wears many hats. She has been director, author, producer, and is a member of the board of the American Theatre Wing. Henry Hughes is critic and director and writer. And I am Isabel Stevenson. I am president of the American Theatre Wing. And today's seminar is on the Playscript. And now, Henry and Jean. And thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Isabel. Today we have a program which interests me tremendously because we're going to probe the mysteries of an organization that's almost as secret as the CIA, namely the York Shakespeare Festival. And we have, from the festival, we have pried loose three of its most important workers. On my far right is Thomas Babe, who his first play, Kid Champion, was done at the New York Shakespeare Festival several years ago with Christopher Walken, and it received mixed notices, but the people who liked it liked it very, very much. This was followed by Rebel Women, which Meryl Streep, who appeared, and last year, A Prayer for My Daughter, a play which, as I remember it, in the Drama Critics Circle, voting came in third as the best, in the voting for the best play of the year. The festival is producing two of Mr. Babe's plays this season, one called Fathers and Sons, which is having its press opening tonight, and Taken in Marriage, which is scheduled for next spring. Next to Mr. Babe is Robert Allan Ackerman, a director who won an Obie last year for his direction of Mr. Babe's play, A Prayer for My Daughter, at the Public Theater. And this season at the Public, he is directing two plays by Thomas Babe, Fathers and Sons and Taken in Marriage. However, he can direct plays by other playwrights, and as he's going to try to prove when he stages David Mamet's most recent play, The Woods, which was previously done in Chicago, and which got good notices there. He is currently a resident director at the New York Shakespeare Festival. Next to Mr. Ackerman is Lynn Holst, whose title is Coordinator of the Play Department. And next to me, on my right, is Gail Merrifeld Papp. Is there a hyphen in that or not?
Yes, sometimes.
Depending upon your mood. As Gail Merrifeld, she started out in publishing, and she worked with New Directions and some of the other important publishers. Then she came to the New York Shakespeare Festival as an assistant to the producer, and finally she worked her way down to being the head of the play development program. She, along the way, she took a couple of days off and married Joseph Papp. But I don't think it hasn't interfered with your work.
No, so far.
On my left is Jean Dalrymple, already introduced, but I always like to remind people that her book careers and the opportunities in the theater is a very good place to start if you're going to find a job. And next to Jean, on Jean's left, is David Aldrich, the composer, who came from, originally from Cincinnati, and who composed and orchestrated the music for Gorey Stories, which had a brilliant but brief career on Broadway when it opened and closed in one night, even though I'm told that it was during the newspaper strike, so that we couldn't read the reviews, but I'm told that those people who did write reviews expressed enthusiasm for it. And it's also important that Gorey Stories started off Broadway at the WPA Theater. Next to Mr. Aldrich is Susan Schulman, a play agent who worked originally with ICM, where she was assistant to Audrey Wood, who was a member of our board and I guess the mother of all play agents. After working for ICM, she last year decided to start her own agency, and she has dedicated herself to representing new playwrights, and she's very receptive to new playwrights. On the far left is Stephen Currens, who is an actor who also writes. He wrote Gorey Stories and adapted and directed the show. But he's written other plays, including one called Bertie and Lomi and a comedy called Pharmaceuticals. As an actor, Mr. Currens has appeared in stock and television and film, and he was seen as I in the award-winning educational television series I in the Universe. I thought we might begin today with Mr. Babe, and who I'd like to ask to address the problem of where does the new playwright begin in terms of where do you send your script? How do you get a first hearing with your? Is it 5 copies that they type up for you when you send it to the place?
I make 5 copies.
Yeah. Now, where do you, could you just tell me in where you began and where you know, perhaps from your friends, a new playwright might begin with a new script if he is the first step towards getting a production.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what I did, which was just every time I finished a play, I sent a copy to everybody I knew who produced plays. And that's about 20 or 30 copies in the mail. And the first time I got back a lot of nice letters. And the second time I got back even nicer letters. And that's how I did it. I just looked for a list of places that produce new plays. Many of them don't acknowledge the receipt of them. Some say, this does not suit our purposes. But most do read them. And I think that that's one of the things that everybody should keep in mind. New plays are not, it may take a while in some theaters, but if you know any place that does new plays, send them there. That's what I did.
You sent them cold. In other words, these were
Oh,
not,
yeah. I didn't
know the people involved.
I didn't have any friends in the biz, no, at all. In fact, I got, the way I met Joe Papp was I sent my second play, Kid Champion. I got a telegram back from him. I'd never met him before. I had no contact with the festival, saying, please call me Joseph Papp. So I called him, and he said, I'm halfway through the play. I think I want to do it. I'll get back to you. And I said, well, I just sent you another play. So he said, okay. And I got a telegram 2 weeks later saying, please call Joseph Papp. So I called Joseph Papp, and he said, I've read both of these plays. I want to meet you. And that's how I did it. I mean, there must be a lot of ways. Other writers I know have developed, for example, through teaching situations. They've gone to drama schools, for example, or they know teachers of drama, and they get their work done. A good friend of mine got his work done in Iowa. And there are a lot of places where, for example, the O'Neill Foundation, where new work is actively solicited and taken very seriously. And I would say, just submit right and left.
Well, now you had a play at the O'Neill, and did
Yeah.
you just send it off to the O'Neill, or did you, by that time, know somebody at the O'Neill?
Well, I knew Lloyd Richards from previous contact, and in fact, he asked me if I wanted to solicit, if I wanted to give anything. But that's the thing about, I'd been there, or was supposed to be there 2 summers before, and that's just the loyalty of his asking everybody, I guess, who's ever been there once, if they want to submit again. That's where we did Prayer for My Daughter the first time. But they really do. They read everything. Bob used to be a reader for them. He can tell you about that. And also a reader for the festival. That they take it very seriously. They read everything that comes in. And they try and make a judgment as to not only the worth of the work in and of itself, but what good it will do for them, for example, to do it. What help it will be to the author to develop it, because it's staged readings. But I've found, by and large, that people do take unsolicited submissions seriously.
Where would a person get a list of the most likely places to do a play by an unknown playwright?
That's hard. I put my own together. It's hard. I
mean, I can think of the O'Neill, I can think of the OADR,
well, I came across a book in the library. I guess it's Writer's Digest, Writer's Guide, Writer's Market thing, and they had a list for the theater. And among other things, they listed agents, but they also listed theaters that were actively soliciting new manuscripts. I think you just nose around and try and find.
There's also a list that the Theater Communications Group publishes
TCG.
called Information for Playwrights. It lists all the theaters that take new plays,
Yeah.
the addresses.
Information for playwrights, you
That's
get
right.
it from Theater Communications.
That's right.
Right.
Which address and phone numbers in the phone book.
That's right.
Right. Yeah.
Bob, can you tell us a little bit about how you read plays to decide which ones are being done at the O'Neill?
Well, I was never, that's not true. I wasn't a reader for the O'Neill.
Well, you weren't.
I was on the selection committee for the O'Neill last summer. And so I only read the scripts that had already been screened and were in the final analysis to decide which ones were going to be done.
As I understand it, the O'Neill gets about 200 scripts and reads them, and then
I think they get closer to 1,000
Really?
scripts, and then they reduce that number to about 200. And then it goes through a final selection committee. And that's usually composed of some of the critics who act as dramaturgs up there. And usually they try to have 2 or 3 directors on that committee. And it's that group that selects the plays that will be done that summer.
How many do you select from? From 200 or from
Well,
12?
you try and read as many as you can. You try and read all 200.
All
if
200
you
are
can.
accessible to you, sir?
Yes.
So you flip through, and if a play strikes you on the first few pages, you continue, and if you...
Right. And there are forms. There are forms that are composed that allow you to express exactly what you feel about the play. And then at the end of the form is a final recommendation. And it's very similar to the form that the Shakespeare Festival has. I was a reader at the Shakespeare Festival, and it's a similar form. What is the play about? Comments about it, and then finally, do you think we should do this play?
I thought it's very interesting. The Shakespeare Festival does something where I talked to one of the readers, now Bob, once, and she said that if she reads something that she thinks is good, but it's not her cup of tea, she checks the box that says another read. Have somebody else check it out.
I wish I could do that as a critic. No, I've often advocated, and this, I'm being quite serious, that the New York Times should send 2 critics to a opening night, and at the end of, and then at the after the show, that Richard Eder should turn to Mel Gussow, if that happens to be the 2, and if Mel says, I'm very interested in this play, it excites me. He may not like it entirely, but if it's something he would like to write about, and Richard Eder happens to say, well, I was a little bit bored by it, so why don't you write about it?
Yeah.
Because I think it's terrible to force a critic to write about something of which he is. You see, when a critic gets bored by a play, he tends to turn off.
Yeah.
And so the play is not getting a fair hearing because he's been initially bored.
Yeah.
And I think this, for playwrights coming up, and you can substantiate this if it's true, if you write well in the first few pages, you do your best writing in the first few pages, because that very often people won't go any farther if it's not very good.
But I think that's like going to the theater. If the first 5 minutes of it doesn't grab you, your own consciousness begins to diminish a little bit. That's
sure.
However, there is a built-in catch there, and I know for the Shakespeare Festival you have to put a plot summary. It forces you to read the whole thing.
You have to prove you read it, right?
Even if you hate it.
I was a critic once myself on WMCA, a radio critic, and I had to have everything in at 11 o'clock, and in those days the curtain went up at 8, not real early. And I used to start writing my criticism the moment the curtain went up. And by the time the first act was over, I had my criticism all written in my head. And then I ran and typed it all out and then read it at 11 o'clock. So I always say to playwrights, for goodness sake, interest everybody in 15 minutes. Because that's the way certainly the TV and the radio critics do it. You have to.
It must be very hard because you're sitting there at the same time you're trying to watch theater, you're also trying to write your review.
That's right.
Paragraph by paragraph.
Well, you can't do 2 things at once.
You have to in that case.
Yeah. Perhaps Susan or Stephen or David, that you would like to make some comment about submitting your play and getting started. What was the case with the plays? I mean, you have more than one play that you've submitted. Only one of them has been done on Broadway. But what was your experience?
Well, actually, my idea of getting this play ahead was to sort of not do anything except to produce it wherever I could. And the very first production of Gorey Stories took place in a very unlikely situation at the University of Kentucky Theater Department. But had a very nice production there, and that's where I learned about it, learned to deal with it and to rewrite it, to develop it, because it was a developed script rather than something I sat down and did at a typewriter.
Well, you had an in there because you were associated with the university, right?
That's right. And then I came to New York in 1976, really to be an actor more than anything, but kept pursuing the script because several friends of mine who had been involved with the project before felt that it definitely needed a hearing in New York, and submitted it several times to different places and usually got a positive answer, but nothing ever worked out. And then finally the WPA Theater decided to do it. That was shortly after Dracula, and Edward Gorey had been recognized in the theater as a designer, and I think the interest in his work was different than it had been prior to that.
You didn't submit it to the New York Shakespeare Festival, or did you?
No, I didn't. Well, at the WPA Theater, I did at one time write, and so did the WPA, and invited several people to come down.
And what was the result of that? Did somebody come?
No, well, I don't know. Somebody over there can say, no, I don't think so. But we had several producers interested, and so we were actively pursuing anybody's interest that we could.
Susan, as an agent, what do you do about when finding these new playwrights who, and do you go out and look for them, or do you count on them mailing scripts into you? And when you find them, do you send them on the same route that Tom took with his play?
Just about. I don't really find writers under rocks, but sometimes it's like that. You find them everywhere. Sometimes you inherit a writer. Sometimes you know them from the past. As a former college teacher, some of my former students have come to me. So that's one way. But I have an absolute open-door policy. I'll read anything that anybody submits to me, as long as it's at least legible, that it's typed. And I will not promise to read it from beginning to end, but I will give it what I consider to be a fair read. Since I'm a one-man shop at this point, it may take me a while, and people become impatient, and they consider their writing their life, and so do I. I take it very seriously, and I don't play around with people's properties. But it takes a while, and I will read it as far as I think the piece justifies. Sometimes it's very young, and therefore the comment required is quite different from someone who is progressed in their craft and requires, I think, a heavier, more substantial comment. So I'll read, if you tell me that you have a nephew who writes, I will willingly accept the script, and I will get to it, and I will respond, and you'll get your script back, or I'll do something with it. But the next step really is where I met Stephen and David. And in this case, I represented David because of a rather complicated situation. We had a collaboration team, and they were already in the offices of the agency without representation. They had been invited there by the producers, and they desperately needed representation because not only does the agent read, but the agent represents, and the agent's there to protect, really to protect the property and the client. And I think that's really initially where our relationship began, because they weren't protected and they needed it. Not only were they not protected, but the script itself, the Gorey Stories, is based upon 13 short stories by Edward Gorey, who's a published writer. And since this is really for practical information for people interested in writing, if you are going to base a piece for live stage performance on somebody else's writing, please be sure beforehand to acquire permission to do so from the author. It saves a lot of aggravation and time, possibly expense and legal suit.
Possibly.
Now, tell me, when you happen to like a new script, do you send them a telegram, or?
I wish I could afford to do that. First, I jump up and down, and I'm very happy. As I said, with an open-door policy, I'll read anything. I know a lot of writers, and I know where many people are in their careers, but you don't often see something that is worthy of production. And that's strange. That route is very strange, in fact. With the Gorey Stories, Stephen said it started at the University of Kentucky, where he had an affiliation. It came to the WPA, it was picked up by producers, and about 8 months later it got on Broadway. The play that's reviewed in the Times this morning, Jeff Sweet's Porch, is a one-act. It's at the Encompass Theater here in New York. I've been trying for 2 years to get the play produced. I read it because it appeared in Best Short Plays of 1976 without a production. What do I do? Once I find something I like and I respond, which makes my week, because I've read lots of things that aren't great.
Do you respond with a letter, or do you respond, or do you ask the playwright to come in and talk to you?
Both. Usually telephone call, unless they happen to be within shouting distance, and sometimes they are. And I try to share with them my enthusiasms and what I know about representation and about this business of show business, because that's where I come in. It is a business, and I'm there to make a deal. And I caution them on all of the pitfalls, and David and Stephen and I will not elaborate upon all of those, but it's difficult. Once we find the good script, then the problems start, and I'm sure Tom Babe and everyone else here can agree with what I'm saying. That's the beginning, and it goes downhill from there until you get it on.
What do you do about rejections? Do you have just send them a form rejection, or do you try to encourage them, even though you know that this is not somebody that you want to represent?
I can honestly say I think every play script, every writer is individual, and play scripts reflect where they are in their writing career. There's some people who are not writers, and in all fairness to them, it would be a disservice to encourage them, I think. And after all, I run a business. I'm here to make a profit from my writers' productions. So if a person isn't a writer, I cannot be encouraging. I can be fair and say, it's not for me. If it's really terrible, I don't recommend that they try to submit anywhere else.
But
it's just not for me.
Do you just send it back and say, without explaining why you didn't like the script, or do you just say, this is not for me?
I will give a why if I think it can be fixed. But again, it's a very subjective response, just as you as a critic may respond one way and Mr. Dalrymple may respond another. I think play readers, and Lynn will, I think, go along with this, we're subjective too. We have our personalities, our background, our tastes. And there are some things that I don't know about, and therefore I'm not really equipped to respond positively to the script, although I think I can recognize good writing.
Well, I know a lot of agents, and perhaps this is your work too. A lot of agents complain that when they send scripts to producers, the producers just send back and say no, but they wish that the producers would explain why that they didn't do it, because the agent wants to know which producers are likely to produce which kind of scripts, and if they're sending scripts to a particular producer that is not the kind of script that that producer would do, they want to know that, and they also want to be able to go back to their playwright and say, David Merrick doesn't like the script because it doesn't have enough social significance, or whatever it is that he.
Well, I think that's the ideal situation where everyone could give each writer in each script a critique and a very intelligent, articulate response. But unfortunately, we're in a pressured business, and it's a business where there are many writers, and there are many good writers. It's not the producer's job to criticize, in my opinion, not being a producer. I also think it's the agent's job. I'm not a dramaturge, nor am I a literary critic. I'm a businesswoman. And my skills are to make a good deal and to protect my client and to protect the property.
Hear, hear.
David, do you want to just say a word about the difficulty of getting started as an adapter? You can't, it's a little harder to bring a tape of your music in, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't mean adapter, I mean a composer
yes.
of incidental music or
Yes.
background music or whatever it is.
Well, I didn't really have any difficulty because Stephen and I both started at the same time, practically. We were both at the University of Kentucky. And we were introduced by a mutual friend who said Steve was looking for a composer. He had done the play once before, and with using public domain music, and he wanted some original music. So we were introduced, and we did it in 1974. And when Steve got the play done up here, he called me on the phone. I was in Lexington working as an arranger, and in Cincinnati. And he said, "Come on up. We've got somebody to do the play." So I came up, and we did it at the WPA. Edward Gorey came to see it and loved the music. And so that's
how many pieces was it? Was it one piano or what?
No. It was originally it was conceived as a sort of a chamber idea of piano, harp, and cello. And at the University of Kentucky, where we had a little more material means, I had percussion. So it changed from one place to the next. And on the Broadway production, I added a woodwind. Well,
now you had the advantage of, I suppose it didn't cost you hardly very much to make the original tape, but going to Broadway, I would suppose that you would have to get a fully unionized thing.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole different ballgame.
Lynn, perhaps you could say a word about if you're involved in this, about how you respond to scripts that you like or don't like, or in terms of getting back to the playwright with feedback?
Unfortunately, we don't either detail reasons why we return a script. We're likely to say it's not for us, or occasionally if someone gets in touch with me and asks specifically where can I send my script if you're not interested, if it's something that I can easily recommend to a certain theater, for example, a script that would be right for the labor theater, I mean that's sort of recognizable, I'll do that. But because we get so many scripts, as Susan was saying, it's a very pressured situation. We really can't, we don't have the staff or the time to provide that kind of service. It's too bad, because it's a needed one.
Gail, I'd like to zero in now on the New York Shakespeare Festival, and perhaps you could tell us how what started out to be a producer of Shakespeare has gradually now turned to be, I think, has made an equally important contribution in the area of new plays. And the emphasis at the Public Theater seems to be on new plays. And I was wondering if you could perhaps trace how that came about, and then how your own department came into being.
Well, the interest in new plays came about because after producing Shakespeare in the Park and on the Mobile Theater for a number of years, we decided that in order to keep that vital and alive, that it needed to be infused with new works, new blood, as they do in other theaters. And
it's like Peter Hall always says that the Royal Shakespeare Company, it was essential that they do Pinter as well as Shakespeare.
That's right,
and
exactly.
Because the way they did Pinter affected the way they did Shakespeare.
Yes, and there's a very interesting interaction that happens then, which is good for both. Also, there are many new plays around and new playwrights that we knew were not getting produced at the time. This is back in around mid-60s. So we acquired the Public Theater building, which has 7 theaters in it. They weren't all there to begin with. We built them one by one. We started out with one. And while it was under construction, the first theater, we thought, all right, well, now we have to find these new works that we want to produce. And we sat down around the table, we scratched our heads and said, well, how do you find new plays and new playwrights? It just started from scratch. So I said, well, we tell our friends, and we'll write to a few people, we'll write to agents, and just start letting it be known in general. So plays started coming in, and we started reading. We had one reader to begin with, which was me. And then we added another one when the load got a little heavier. And we now have a staff of 20 readers. And we get about 3,000 scripts a year, which is a tremendous load, but we read them all. And I would say in the last 5 years, the department's grown enormously.
Well, now, as a producing organization, as I remember it, Joe's first switch was the season in which he did Hair.
That was our first play, and the way that happened, he was teaching up at Yale those days, about twice a week, and he was on the train going up there one day, and this guy sat down next to him, had bushy hair, and he struck up a conversation. And this guy said, what do you do? And Joe said, well, I produce plays. And he said, really? He says, I'm working on this play. He says, I'm having a lot of problems with it. He said, maybe you could take a look at it. And Joe said, sure, what it's about. He said, well, he says, you just read it. So he gave him this manuscript, and Joe brought it back. I remember it was on legal-sized paper, because they had a thing about, they liked to type their stuff in legal-sized paper, these authors. And it's big, bold letters across it said Hair, H-A-I-R. And I thought, that's a strange name for a play. And that was how Hair happened. They just met on a train. I mean, plays happen in all different kinds of ways.
He seems to like bushy-haired people. I think it helps. But that first season, it was a mixture of new play. Hair was a new play, and then there was a foreign play from Czechoslovakia.
We did play by Václav Havel, and which was a very fine play, won Best Foreign Play award that year.
So in a way, this commitment to new play came about almost accidentally.
Well, the accidents happen.
Yeah.
We were looking actively for new work. That's what we wanted to do. We went through a kind of Middle European phase in our second season because we were still trying to find our way, just what the nature of the theater would be. So we did some foreign works, but our main emphasis has been on new works by American writers and composers.
Well, now, how did you go from the? How did you start this play development program, and where does it fit into the other activities at the New York Shakespeare Festival?
Well, it was always there. I mean, it
was there with you as a reader, just trying to find new plays. But then,
that's right.
But now, as I understand it, you have a program that once you find a new play, there is private work done on it in an organized way.
That's right. We're now able to, if a play is of interest, we usually have at least 3 readings, some kind of consensus of readers on a play before it comes to me and I read it. And what we often do is have a reading of the play if we feel it's not something that's ready for production. And we have excellent staged readings. We invite an audience to the readings.
You invite an audience to the readings. How does a person get on the invitation list? One, by not being a critic, I guess.
No, by knowing somebody who's in the play, who's the writer, the director, or
so
from
the
the staff.
actors actually friends?
Yeah, it's just friends. Friendly people.
By being in the building. Right?
Yeah, being in the building helps too.
Perhaps we could take an actual example of perhaps one of Tom's plays that you directed and trace what happened to it from the time that it was accepted at the Shakespeare Festival to the time that it was produced.
Yeah. Well, I think Prayer for My Daughter is a perfect example because Bob and I worked on it at the O'Neill Conference. But first of all, I read it at the pre-conference weekend out loud to a bunch of people. That's what you do at the O'Neill. Every playwright reads his own work. Then Robert and I met and tore it apart and put new stuff into it. Then we did it at the O'Neill as a staged reading. You get 3 days of rehearsal, and there are 2 performances. People walk around with scripts in their hands. You won't believe what people can do with scripts in their hands. And then we stopped, and we did a workshop at the Public Theater. But in the meantime, he and I took it apart again. Then we did the workshop, then we stopped, and he and I took it apart again. And then we did a full production. So by the time we did it, we'd had a real crack at working on it and getting it right. And I think that's very, very important. Very important not just to finish something, but to realize that when you submit it, when they get it, when you start working on it, it's not done. You've got to be willing to collaborate with the people you work with. And you've got to be willing to be flexible and trust them. And that's how Bob and I have worked.
Well, now, you know, every time people appear on a program like this, they always, everything is very lovey-dovey, and people always say...
This is not lovey-dovey. This is hard work I'm talking about. I'm not talking about lovey-dovey.
No,
I'm talking about phone calls at 4 in the morning and lovey-dovey.
Having been at the O'Neill and watched some of these works being done, I know that there is a lot of disagreement and argument that goes into this, and that there are moments when you say, this is not my play they're doing something else.
Well,
and so on. And that I wanted to suggest that I would like to ask Bob if he would trace his initial reaction to A Prayer for My Daughter, what he thought the play needed, how that changed the play from what Tom had originally written or even intended, and then the further steps at the New York Shakespeare Festival, which ended with a production which still may not be in Tom's mind the ideal, or in your mind the ideal, but
changes were made on that script right up to the time it
2 weeks before closing, we made a change.
Tom, you might tell them, or Bob, you might tell them about the system at the O'Neill where they put pink pages and yellow pages in.
When you work at the O'Neill, the interesting thing is that you don't know what you're going to be doing. You have, as a director, you have no choice as to what material you respond to or which play you think you would like to do. You're given a play, and they say, here, direct it. I first read A Prayer for My Daughter at the pre-conference weekend. It's a weekend when it takes place about a month or 2 months before the actual conference begins. And all the playwrights and all of the directors meet, and the writers for 3 days all read their plays to all of the other writers and directors. It's sort of like a very radical therapy weekend. Just sitting in a room listening to playwrights read their plays from 7 in the morning till 11 at night. And my initial response to Prayer for My Daughter, I read it and then I heard Tom read it, was that it was an interesting play, but I wasn't quite sure what it was about. I remember the first question I asked Tom. We had never met before. Hi, I'm directing your play. What is it about?
What is it about? And I said, I hate those kind of questions, and I'm not going to answer it.
But he did, and I think that's why the play developed into something that was
What did he say the play
quite
was about?
successful.
At that time.
None of your damn business. No, I said something that it turned out that the play was, yeah.
He said that it was about the difference between men and women. And it was an interesting response. I don't know if you know the play.
Yes. But you might explain to the people here what actually happens in the play, so that you can see where that comment fits in.
You want to do that?
No, you do it.
The play is about two macho policemen who arrest two alleged murderers. One is an admitted homosexual and the other is a bisexual. And the four of them spend a very harrowing evening in the station house. It's a series of interrogations. It's four men, and it keeps breaking down into the various pairs, so that by the end of the evening, every conceivable twosome has been explored. And during the course of the evening, one of the policemen receives a phone call that his daughter is attempting to commit suicide. And what the play is about is his lack of response. He refuses to go and do anything about it. And during the course of these interrogations, a lot of discussion takes place about men and women. And essentially, what is going on is the men allowing the female aspects of them to die because they sort of can't deal with that. But that was not clear in the original script. The play was so rich, really, when I first read it, but it could have been about any number of things. When I work with a writer, in response to what you were saying about writers saying that they don't feel that the play is theirs anymore, I would never attempt to impose what I think the play should be about. What I try and do is keep zeroing in on what the writer wants it to be about. And once I think I'm clear about that, I try and direct all our further discussions to that point. It may be not the play that I want to direct or the play that I would have liked to have written. I might have thought something else was much more interesting. But I don't think that serves the writer at all.
Well, I know that when Kazan was doing Tennessee Williams plays and was exerting a considerable directorial influence to persuade Tennessee to make changes in the script that didn't come spontaneously. I asked Kazan about it one time, and he said, I always try to make each writer write more of the play that is in him than he perhaps dares to put on paper.
Right.
And that so that whether it came out that way or not, he did try to encourage the playwright to go even further in the direction that he, Kazan, thought the playwright wanted to go. Now, you have a problem if Tom says my play is about this, and you say that's what he thinks, but as Kazan might have said about Williams, but I see in this play something much richer and much more important, and it's going to be my job during the production of this play for him to make him discover what I see in the play and develop that so that it becomes clear to the audience and to a much greater extent than perhaps he even wants to make it clear.
But when I answered, much against my will, Bob's question, what is this play about? He said, "Are you sure it's about that?" That's all he said. And then he set out to make it about that.
I must say that when I saw the play Prayer for My Daughter, the phone calls about his daughter's suicide, I had the feeling that there was some long-standing family quarrel between him and his daughter, and that he was unwilling to back down from the position he'd taken in this quarrel. As everybody knows who's in a family situation, this was much broader implications than just this incident. And that for that reason, there was this impasse that the man wanted to save his daughter and didn't want her to commit suicide, but that he was prevented from doing so by the fact that he couldn't change the stance that he had taken, which I didn't think was entirely macho. It just seemed to me that it might be any father-son or a father-daughter relationship. But to push is not necessary, I suppose, for me to be right about that interpretation, as long as what comes on stage is sufficiently ambiguous.
Yeah.
Can we disagree with that?
We can.
Henry, Lynn, what she saw in it when she read it.
Lynn and Gail, were you innocent bystanders here, or did you put your minds and
I wasn't
souls
innocent
into this?
bystander. I saw it when it was done at O'Neill. Joe and I went up there to see it. And I was just absolutely knocked out by the play. I thought it was one of the most powerful things I'd ever seen. And in fact, I never quite recovered from it.
No.
And I don't always feel that I fully understand a play. In fact, most of the time I feel that I don't understand many of the most interesting plays that I read. That doesn't bother me anymore. It used to. I feel that I have some kind of response. I feel Susan said I can recognize good writing, no matter how it comes at me. And it comes at me in all kinds of very strange forms. Sometimes it's not a play. I get a good deal of poetry that has interesting dramatic content and potential for the theater.
Sentozaki Shange did you respond to her as
Oh,
a poet before you?
absolutely,
Before
absolutely,
For Colored Girls? only?
absolutely.
For Colored Girls are
Yes.
considered suicide when the rainbow is
Is enough.
What is the process between the readers and getting to Joe Papp, who says, "Come, I want to see you, I read this play"? What happens between that? How does a play get to Joe Papp after the readers?
Oh, Lynn, do you want to comment on that? Or what that process is?
Yeah, I sort of oversee the first step, which is we have a staff of 20 freelance readers, and the script comes in and it's given to one of those readers. Part of what I do is keep in sort of close contact with the readers. When they come in with the script, we talk about the report. I talk to them about their weekend or something. Also, because we feel it's important. I mean, as people are with personality and background and a bad or a good week when they're looking at a script, and it's important to know where they are in their lives in some way, especially if it's something that you think might be something that you might want to recommend to Mr. Papp. It gets at least one reading. If it's clearly not something that we would be likely to do, it gets sent back. It will get a second or a third reading if there's a possibility, or if there's something very interesting going on. Sometimes if there's a contradiction in what the play seems to be about and what the reader feels about it, I might give it to another reader, even though that first reader is saying send it back because I just feel there's something the reader missed. At that point, if it's something that is recommended, I'd hand the reports over to Gail and we talk about it. And at that point, either Gail would read it or and this happens a lot, we have too many scripts, I might read it. And then at that point it's discussed again, and then Gail makes a decision whether to bring it up with Mr. Papp, and possibly a reading would be set up. If there isn't a director already attached, we would talk about who the appropriate director would be for the stage reading. And it goes from there.
How much can you do without having to go through, Joe? I mean, do you have a certain autonomy to proceed through readings and exploration up to a point where Joe is faced with spending a considerable amount of money to continue it, or does he come in at the beginning and say, I don't really think very much of this project?
Joe spends the money. I mean, he's the one that makes financial decisions as far as a work in progress might be concerned on a play or on a workshop production, which is really a workshop production at the festival is really a full-scale production, but it's limited to 12 performances, 12 to 24 performances under equity regulations, and it's usually done in a smaller theater. But otherwise, it's a full effort that's given to the play. As you can see, if you see Tom's current play, Fathers and Sons, which Bob has directed beautifully, is a stunning production.
What's the approximate production cost for a 3-week, 12-performance run and all the work that goes into it of a play like?
Well, it can be up to $25,000.
Now, what if you and Joe disagree about the merits of a project?
I've been dying to ask you. Thank you.
We have some terrific fights.
Does he ever say, well, I don't like it, but if you like it, go ahead?
No, he's the boss. It's his decision, finally.
Could I ask a money question? How do you return the scripts? Do you ask the author to come pick them up, or do you mail them back? If they don't, send a stamped addressed envelope?
Yes, we do.
You do?
Yes, scripts are very costly to reproduce.
Yes, I know that.
So that we always return the script, even if there's nothing closed with it.
Henry,
Yes.
I'd like to ask Stephen if you felt that you should have gone through the process that Thomas did with
Isabel, I think
over and over again.
In a minute we're going to take a break, and I think I would like to get to that when we can give Stephen time to do that.
Oh, wait, you can think about it in the meantime.
What about this business of inviting critics to see the workshop productions? Is it a policy not to, or is it?
No, our policy is we try to protect the work. We try to protect the play, because the workshop production is still a part of the discovery and exploration of the play. And if we feel that we're not far enough along with it, we want to give it some more time before it's exposed to other people's judgment and a kind of pressured situation, which is not the best way to work. So we try to protect that very, very carefully. If we feel that it's a fine work that is succeeding artistically and has been realized in a very fine way, of course we want people to see it then, and we want it reviewed. And we're very happy to have the critics come in.
We have to take a break now, and we'll be back in a couple of minutes. So if you'll stand by. I don't know about I want to start by dealing with a question that Thomas Babe asked me when I referred to the New York Shakespeare Festival as mysterious as the CIA. I suppose that was prompted by a remark that Edward Albee made, which he said most of the best stuff that's done at the public theater is never seen by the public. And I do think that very few people understand the inner workings of the public theater. My own relationship with Joe and Gail and all the people down there has always been fairly cordial. I had one period of icy relations that lasted about 3 months, but I must say that Joe doesn't hold a grudge. And also, I think that I wanted to say, in fairness to Joe, and also to understand the way he works, is that I've always found that on talking to him on different occasions that he would express opinions that were different from the last time he spoke. And but I do think that in a way this is very healthy, that it's not possible to make a rationale about what Joe will like or will not like. He gets a divine message from somewhere, which and he's inspired by it, and this may require him to take a very different position than he took a week earlier. Nevertheless, it does add to the mystery and the illogicality and of what happens at the New York Shakespeare Festival, all of which is none of which is subversive, or I don't know that they've had anyone murdered, but I did want to make that clear, and I'd like to in turn ask you people who work there, do you feel that you have a full understanding of how the New York Shakespeare Festival works, and could you predict the response of Gail and Joe to a given script before you give it to them?
No.
No.
So that
in
it is.
fact, when I gave Joe the first draft of A Prayer for My Daughter, he said, "This is interesting, but I'm not doing this kind of thing now." And we did it 6 months later.
That's what we had our
But
big
that's
fight
what-
about, by the way.
Really? Oh, okay. Sorry. No, it's the logic. I don't think it's divine revelation. I just think he gets inspired different ways, different times, and that's what.
Does Joe not? Does Joe? Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, and he's never seems to be afraid of saying, "Yeah, I didn't like it then, but I love it now."
Yeah, he doesn't mind changing his
Oh
mind.
no, which is wonderful.
And
And
the other
it's-
thing that I think is important is that once you've worked there, he's very loyal to you. I mean, it may be hard to get in there once, but then his loyalty is something that's very admirable.
And he's loyal to you even if you don't give him every one of your plays?
But I've given him everything in place.
I mean, that's really the test. I mean, David Rabe is a case in point, and I think David wants to go back and do something at the Public Theater with Joe now. But there was a period where David had a play done at Long Wharf, and this was in a certain sense wouldn't call it disloyalty, but it was doing a play that he didn't give to Joe first. After Joe had discovered.
That's not true. Joe did have the play first.
Oh, but he turned it down?
No, he didn't turn it down.
We're talking about streamers, by the way.
we weren't able to schedule it, and we planned a reading of it in the meantime. And then he had another opportunity. We didn't stand in the way of his doing it there.
Yeah, and the loyalty I'm talking about is based not on any kind of sentimental crap. It's based on a genuine collaboration. You know, if you work with someone as closely as I've worked with Joe, or as I've worked with Bob, that builds the loyalty. It's the respect based on the effort you put in, I think. And that's very important. It's not just patting you on the head and saying, go to it.
I think that goes for actors and performing people as well. And I think Raul Julia in our performance seminar stated that very well. When he needed a job so badly and called Joe and said, I just have to work in the theater.
They made him head usher, which was...
Joe said, I can't do anything else
For
but
which he was
come
very grateful,
and
but,
be an usher.
Yeah.
He said that was important.
That was many years ago.
It's a
And he
commitment
developed
to
it.
growth. It's a commitment to growth. You don't just do one play and die. You know, I got killed in Kid Champion, as you know, Henry. But it was the opening night of Kid Champion, before a single review had come out. Joe said, I'm going to do your next play.
That's wonderful. I don't know whether you're going to be so fortunate, Stephen. You have having a producer come to you, whether John Wolpe has said, don't worry about Gorey Stories, we will do your next play.
No, he didn't say that.
perhaps you could tell us a bit about the saga of Gorey Stories, and perhaps I can interject something about you, because at last year's seminars, you were out in front listening to some of these panels.
I was working the door, actually.
Oh, you didn't get to hear them?
I heard.
Oh, yes,
a little bit.
that's why I was working the door.
But perhaps you'll tell us a little bit about the your difficulties in getting started, and also what's going to happen now that you have had one brilliant failure.
Well, idyllically, I really would like to work in a developmental way, and that is what I started out doing with Gorey Stories. I was kind of set up by the university in a way that was very good, in which they said, here is the budget, you have this much time, and do what you want. And so as far as getting David Aldrich to be the composer and everything else, it was up to me. And that was a very nice way. But I was also interested in working with a group of actors and with composers and musicians in a way that we could all speak very, very openly and very, very freely. And I always felt that if I had to be the director in those circumstances, that however many 12 heads were going to be better than one, and that I would have to make the final decisions, but that's the way I like to work. And then coming to New York, of course, we went into a showcase situation at the WPA, which changed somewhat that feeling for me. First of all, I didn't direct it there. And it became probably more difficult for me than if I had only been a playwright and had never worked on the project in any other way, because I had very definite ideas about what should be done, what it should look like and sound like and everything. And I tried to remove myself as much as possible without abandoning the project. But it was a different style of working from that which I would like to do. And I can't say that I was unhappy with that experience totally, but it is not my ideal of the way to work. And furthermore, it's a kind of a situation at the WPA Theater where they were a new company again, starting a new company from an old organization. And I think that they felt that it was very important to acquire the right audience, to have the right artists working with them and that sort of thing. So on from there, on to Broadway was basically due, I think, to Edward Gorey's interest in John Wolpe and Sam Cohen, ICM, who came down and really loved the show and wanted to do something with it.
But I gather that you were not completely happy with the show that they saw, and that what you're saying, in a way, is that you would like to be not only the author but the director of your works, because otherwise what is achieved is different from your vision of it.
No, not always. I think not always, no. I have plays that have been directed by other people, and I've gotten along very well with them and been very happy. In this particular instance, I had directed the production before, twice, and David and I had worked in a very close way. And, we get along very well, and I kind of build on his music and he builds on my writing, and it's very close, and it becomes almost indistinguishable as to who really thinks and does what.
Do you think you should not have come to Broadway that soon?
I had never had any intentions whatsoever of putting this show on Broadway. A showcase was fine with me. Off-Broadway, maybe. I think the show had potential off-Broadway. I think it still does. I think it's a good show. And to me, Broadway was not, it probably was just not in my idea of where I wanted to be in the theater at that point in my life.
Should an agent not have advised him at that point? What is the role of an agent manager, to say, I think that you ought to wait, don't, even though it might not be to the advantage of the agency?
Well, first of all, and this was a very special case in that when the clients came to me, they already had a producer interested in optioning the piece. The producer then can do whatever he wants. Once he acquires the rights, he can hire Stephen as an actor. As long as he has the rights, he can hire him as an actor, a director. He can hire a director that he wants to raise money on if he has a big name or a star, and eliminate anybody and use whatever he wants. So in this case, it wasn't a case of advising. It was a case of protection of rights and making sure everything was in order. But yes, I do see, at least, I can't speak for every agent, but I see part of the role that I have to play, particularly because I'm the junior agent in town, and most of my clients, if they may not be young in years, they're definitely young in their careers. And the career is, it can be, through reviewers, destroyed in one bad move, and you try to prevent that bad mood. If at all possible, you try. It's not always possible. This is a heavy political situation sometimes, but you try to guide, and you try, the ideal situation would be to get a writer into the New York Shakespeare Festival, where he would have a home base, maybe a stipend, maybe a place to work. That's very important. It's hard to make a living as a playwright when you haven't got anything produced yet. Or if you're out of town, maybe the Milwaukee rep. I would try to guide my clients to a home. A home base is the most important thing, where they're not really stripped bare from the very beginning and reviewed by, the New York Times, and that's their first and last play. It's kind of does a big deal to the ego. It can destroy it. Again, this was a special case. We really didn't, you can't leap in with a Broadway producer and say, sorry, we don't want to sell this for Broadway. It just doesn't work that way.
It takes great determination to do that. I know that in Gail, in the Shakespeare Festival, there have been, I know David, when he first wanted to go uptown with some of his plays, and he said, what do you think? And I said, well, you've got a wonderful audience here, you've got great notices. What can you gain by going uptown? And he took, it was Sticks and Bones, and he took it uptown, where it ran at a slight loss every week, and Joe ran it because he felt it was important to get that exposure. But actually, there was no reason why that should have to go uptown in order for David Ray to consider himself a successful playwright.
Yes, but there are other reasons. One, we want to reach a broader popular audience, which is the Broadway audience, and there was such an audience that came. It was not a capacity audience, but there was a very healthy audience that did come to see that work. And also, the playwright is paid more because of the whole economics of that situation, so he gets something that he can live on. And that's very important to all of us. And also, you were then eligible for certain kinds of recognition, and in the case of Sticks and Bones, it won the Tony Award that year, which it would not have done if it had remained downtown. It wouldn't have been eligible.
Jean, how does that change? I mean, what are the changes that have taken place since you were producing and accepting scripts?
Oh, I still am. I get many. As a matter of fact, I accepted one last spring, and I was intrigued by the title, just as Gail was by Hare. It was The Origin of Species, a new musical based on Darwin's theory of evolution. I read it very carefully, and it was very clever and very, very good. And I tried it out last summer at Lucille Lortel's White Barn, and it was a big success.
How did it come to you? How did it come to you?
It was just submitted to me. And, of course, I knew the author, who was Howard Kissel of Women's Wear, a critic.
A critic, yes.
Yes.
They make the best authors.
But there was a tryout, and it needed work. So then we tried it out again. You never will believe this, in Shreveport, Louisiana. It was invited down there, and I felt that it still needed more work. It is definitely an off-Broadway production. I do not feel that it's at all right for Broadway. And, of course, the authors would like it to be on Broadway. They always do, because no matter what anyone says, if a play is on Broadway, it's really accepted all over the world. And if it's off-Broadway, although off-Broadway is becoming more and more important, it still doesn't have the same cachet.
Well, the Hotel Baltimore, which Kermit did off-Broadway, acquired a kind of reputation through a long run.
Yes.
However, Kermit said that he would not have done it off-Broadway. He did it just before the prices changed in terms of salary. And there almost is no economically feasible way to run a play off-Broadway, that is, with off-Broadway salaries and obligations, and so that if you want to go beyond your workshop production, the best way to do it is either to go to Broadway and take a chance that maybe it will go on Broadway, or to do what they do sometimes in the public theater, which, like with John Guare's plays, they ran them for more than with a workshop production.
We convert to a full production then and give the play a run. We did that
They
with
ran
Tom's
Prayer for 4 months.
play.
Yeah. And not all, but does that cost you something, or does
It costs a tremendous amount of money. It has to be subsidized.
Yeah.
It's not an economically viable situation in a 300-seat theater. There's no way that you can pay your way in a 300-seat theater. So we are a nonprofit organization, and everything we do is through that kind of subsidy.
Well,
Stephen,
I'm a commercial producer, and I would do this musical off-Broadway because I think it belongs there. I think if it were on Broadway, the critics might just say, this is not for Broadway.
But will it work out financially?
More or less. I mean, I'll never make any money from it, but I think it deserves to be seen, and I think the authors deserve having it play. And I've always been terribly altruistic, and I wish I weren't. But when I find something that I really like and that I think deserves a place in the theater, I go ahead and do it, whether it's going to cost me money or whatever. I think that's why I'm in the theater, and I think that's the way I can use my talent.
Well, now, A Prayer for My Daughter will obviously go on and get productions elsewhere in the country, and has already been produced in London. So you're beginning to get some royalties beyond this initial showing at the Public Theater. Now, I'm just wondering about Stephen's play. If it's not economically feasible to have a run of this play off Broadway now, what other recourse do you have with it?
Well, perhaps Susan could talk about that. Actually, contractually, it was a very difficult thing to put together between Edward Gorey, David Aldrich, and myself. And so there is, actually at this point, all rights are.
There's no alternative.
There's no alternative.
Unless we go back and renegotiate with Mr. Gorey in order to get permission to base Gorey Stories on his stories again, we really don't have a future for the piece. Maybe for some of the music there might be, and certainly for Mr. Gorey's stories there's a future, but as far as the entity, the Broadway musical piece, Gorey Stories, there is no future because legally it's not possible. There's, in the musical theater, unlike Thomas Babe and Prayer for My Daughter, he owns the copyright and all the rights are retained by him. In an adaptation or in a musical piece like Platinum, which would be another case if it closes soon, and the Gorey Stories, you have a merger of rights, which takes place normally 21 performances after the official Broadway or off-Broadway opening. And if the rights from the different people do not merge, say the composer, the adapter, and the basic work, then everything splits and you go back to ground one. And that can be after years and years of effort, time, and dollars. So there's no future.
Now, Stephen, you have a couple of other plays. Where will they try to get their hearing?
Well, actually, at this point, I am in a process of developing something with David that we would like to do. We have a project that we are working on, and we feel really good about it. My plays, as far as my own writing goes, that is my career as an actor is very real to me, and so I do it in tandem. I don't feel as though I can get very excited about writing alone with a typewriter. And so that's why I often work in collaboration, like with David as a composer, or I'm in production. I have done several of my plays where I came in basically with a play written, but knew that that was not the play that would be the final product. And I like to work with actors that way.
Improvising and so on?
Not necessarily improvising, but as you progress along and you see, it's just, it's almost like the same relationship over here, except that I was doing both parts. And I was trying to criticize myself, and I had my actors to help me because I asked them to. And I'd say that my plays probably at this point are yet to be written in the sense that they are there, but I want to work on them with actors in a workshop type situation.
What about the O'Neill situation? Would you go into that?
Oh, sure.
How about the interaction, Gail, on the, Do you give the playwright much interaction from aside from what Bob gives him?
No, basically, I feel my function is to recognize talent and get it in touch with Joe. Then the relationship is really based on that, and then whatever kind of personal connection that there is, and my feelings about the work. I don't work on the production when it's that far along. That's the time that the director and Joe often will come in.
Well, take a show like For Colored Girls, Entozaki Shangi. Did you work? That seems to be something that must have been worked on in improvisation.
Yeah, she worked on it a great deal. And she worked on it at various places, coffee clubs, bars, all over town. I mean, she out on the West Coast in her friends' living rooms, in her own living room. She worked on it a long, long time, and before she showed it to us. And she's very open about suggestions, so she will come to a lot of us. She'll come to me or Lynn or anybody else, say, what did you think of such and such? Did that seem to work? And so we just give her our responses as people, not as any particular kind of expert authority, because we can be as wrong as anybody else.
It's very hard when you're working to concentrate on more than one or two opinions.
That's right,
also.
yes.
And
You want to limit it.
The first time I met Joe, he said, you and I are going to pick a director, and you and the director are going to do the show, and I'll come in and look. And you can only take so much input. Everybody has an opinion, but you've got to trust one or two people at most, otherwise you go crazy.
Well, you know, I think that Joe realizes himself that his suggestions are not infallible. And I know that as a critic, I've often been asked my opinion about shows that I've seen other towns on. And you suggest something to a playwright, not because that is the answer, but because you think it might be the answer. And sometimes the playwright just is so horrified with the suggestion, he says, thank you very much. Or sometimes he says he really thinks about it, and maybe thinking about it does lead him to doing something about his play. Now, Oz Scott was on one time with us and directed For Colored Girls, and he said Joe came by one day and made some suggestion which he didn't like particularly, and but he said he put it in for a matinee and tried it, and it didn't work. So then he took it out again, and Joe never complained that his suggestion had not been incorporated.
Well, I think that's important, because once Joe sees something, and he usually stays away from rehearsals unless he thinks it's in trouble, he can say 50 things. You're free to pick and choose, because those 50 things, I mean, you know, from the point of view of someone who's lived with it for 4 weeks, 2 of those things could be so spot on that it's mind-boggling. They just unlock something. That's happened every time I've worked with him.
Or they may unlock a 51st thing that you think of.
Right, exactly.
It just sort of frees up the whole process of discovering the work in the proper way. And nobody has you know, a bead on a correct answer. There is no such thing as a correct answer to those problems along the way. You have to explore them and discover them.
Well, very often the correct answer doesn't work.
That's right.
Yes, the correct answer is wrong, as a
It's
matter of
wrong,
fact.
yeah.
And in the theater, only the answers that work are of value. The correct, I mean, I you know, Dryden rewrote Shakespeare's plays, and they're much better plays, but they don't work as well as Shakespeare's.
They were neater.
Yes. We're going to proceed to questions in a minute, but before we do, I would like to ask David, who hasn't said very much.
I've been breathing a lot.
For a composer, the finding of a collaborator is all important, because otherwise you're going to be presenting concerts. And,
Which is okay.
Do you write your own lyrics occasionally?
Yeah, although I'm not as strong in the lyric area, I do write occasionally.
I often feel that there's, you know, I don't know your work, but I know that I know a lot of composers that I've heard on recordings, and I said, why aren't these people being encouraged to come into the theater and write for the theater? I think it's a great waste of our musical talent that so few of the of our best talents are now writing music for the theater.
Yeah.
Do you have any feeling about why that is?
Well, I mean, as a composer, I'm interested in music. I mean, I think just as an actor thinks his art is the noblest in the world, I think that composition or music is the noblest in the world. But giving that its due, I think that there isn't really enough collaboration between composers who are diverse and like music and like to. I think a composer should want to be as diverse as possible. And aside from composing serious, so-called serious music or commercial music or concert music, should want to expand his horizons as much as possible and get into theater.
Now, Peter Link was developed down at the Shakespeare Festival to some degree.
That's
and
right.
He's now the composer for The King of Hearts. And would you say that he was he in workshop with you, or?
Yes, we did workshop work that he collaborated on with Doug Dyer a number of years ago, called Iphigenia. It was a musical work with 12 different Iphigenias. They all sang. And it was very, very interesting. But that was a workshop situation. They worked on that work. And it didn't entirely succeed, but it was extraordinarily interesting.
Well, I have the feeling that and perhaps this is true to some extent of playwrights too, that the work that they do at the public theater, which is free of the commercial pressure, and that they do something like Iphigenia and all this, which doesn't really have a great deal of future, but is worth doing for itself. And then they have to come to terms with the much tougher demands of Broadway if they're going on to become musical comedy writers.
You see, we never start anything at the public theater with the notion that it's going to become commercial. That includes chorus line. We had no notion that was a commercial property, even though there were certain Broadway people connected with it at the beginning, because all we had was an idea. There was no work in existence, just an idea. Certain talented people working on that. And the same is true with Liz Swados, who's now working on a new work. We didn't know what she would come up with when she started on Runaways, which is now on Broadway. And it's been running there for about 6 months. And what happened, the last thing in the world we dreamed would get onto Broadway was Ntozake Shange's For Colored Girls. I mean, that's the most unlikely Broadway play anybody can possibly think of. And yet it played almost 2 years, and it's highly successful on the road. It's broken house records in all the cities it's played in. And
on the other hand, Joe told me about a chorus line that the thing that kept him putting more money into continuing a chorus line at times when he was unsure about whether he wanted to do that was his respect for Michael Bennett's professionalism.
That's right.
And by professionalism, we mean I think, a willingness to come to terms with the demands of a popular theater, as opposed to as somebody who just wants to be an artist and doesn't care whether or not people like it.
well, no, by professionalism, he had confidence in Michael's ability to solve what were regarded as the artistic problems of chorus line. It originally had a story which is very, very cumbersome. You wouldn't believe it if you saw it on the stage now. And it really looked pretty dreadful there for a while.
That's one of the CIA secrets, that original stuff in the chorus line.
We brought colored girls, the wing brought colored girls out to Rikers Island, the Women's House of Detention, and it was one of the most powerful performances that I had ever seen. And the girls were as exhausted from playing to the audience as the audience was in seeing it. It was an enormous
powerful
success
piece.
and terrific reaction from the audience.
We'd like to bring it back.
Oh, it was most gratifying for everybody.
I would like to open the session to questions now. I see someone over here. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I have a question about musical theater, and I was just wondering, how does one go about having, submitting a musical to, say, to the festival? Would you send a tape along with the script, or just what do you do?
Well, we get many, many musicals and musical theater works. They're not musicals in the Broadway sense. We get tapes, we get cassettes. along with the script. Sometimes if the person doesn't have a tape or cassette, we'll accept the script, and if we're sufficiently interested, we'll listen to the music. We'll have it played for us then. But we prefer to get a script with a tape.
With the tape?
Yeah.
And I was thinking, do you think it would be better to complete a work and then submit it, or to get some feedback? I would like to get some feedback on what I'm doing now, but I have no idea how to do that.
Yeah, I think you need to go to other sources for that. We're really not equipped to do that.
To whom would I go?
Well, there's some musical theater workshops that deal in that. I think Lehman Engels place is one place.
Lehman Engels, if you come up afterwards, we'll try to give you the address of that.
Thank you.
There's also the Stuart Ostro.
The Stuart Ostro.
But Stuart really...
That's more geared to production,
I mean,
things.
you have to almost be ready when you go to him, or at least close enough to it. But I think you asked a very good question, that what do you do with if you have a wonderful idea for a musical and you have the ability to write it, but you don't know whether you want to invest all the time in it unless there's going to be some interest. Is there any way to have somebody look at it at an early stage with a synopsis and a scene and a song, and say and be told, go ahead and do this, we're interested, or we don't think very much of the idea?
I don't really think it could happen that way.
I like to get things at that point.
You do?
I'm very willing to have someone call and say they have an idea and an outline and a couple of scenes and a couple of songs. I'm very interested to talk to them and maybe help them. And I'm in the phone book.
Very good.
I am also, and I see outlines, tapes, cassettes, hear auditions, and I think one thing that maybe an agent can't really tell where to go with the piece or what's wrong with it, but you can always give some feedback if you've seen something just like it. For example, I bet I've seen as many 60s musicals as you have.
Yes, we have a question over here.
Thank you for showing up and giving up all the information you have so far. What I wanted to know is the development of a playwright in terms of space to work in. For instance, the public theater seems to be orientated towards really committed to a development of a single of playwrights that are in the organization. Are there any other organizations like that, like the public theater, that you don't have of a commercial piece on hand? Like if I went to Susan for something, it would be commercially orientated constantly, and we'd have to deal with that reality.
Well, everything I look at, I look toward whether it has commercial potential, because I'm an agent, and there has to be some financial potential involved. So let's say you came to me with a script, and it was a straight dramatic piece, and I thought that it was interesting and original, and it was well written, and it showed a lot of potential. I'd try to find you a home, whether it was with the New York Shakespeare Festival, and they would accept you, or someplace else. Not necessarily in New York. Sometimes it's out of town. And try to get the script read in workshop, and perhaps at that place they might transfer it to a main stage.
There are a number of other theaters in New York
Lots of
that,
them.
Yeah,
that
there are quite a few
maintain the
now. I
same
think
kind
that's
of
very
loyalty. Playwrights Horizons, Manhattan Theater Club, they're legion.
Circle Rep?
Yes.
Arena, the
La
Negro
Mama.
Ensemble Company.
It's a whole new idea, and that's why when she says to find a home base, I think maybe
Actually,
that's the most important thing of all.
It sure is.
Many of the talents that are now at the New York Shakespeare Festival started at La Mama, where they don't have as much competition for their space, and they don't give you anywhere near the quality of production because they don't have that kind of facility. But I would say that anybody would get some kind of a hearing if they went to La Mama, and Liz Swados and Andrea Sherban and all the people, a lot of the people who are now with you.
They both originally worked at La Mama. Yes,
at La
that's
Mama.
right.
And they do. So I would say there's no problem in finding organizations that are willing to do an untried work anymore. There once was, but
Yeah, that situation's changed a great deal now, I think.
There are 200 off-Broadway groups, and they're all looking for new plays. I think, would prefer new plays to doing revivals. So that I think that right now in New York, there are more opportunities for new playwrights than ever before in the history of the theater.
I think that, and Susan and Gail can support me in this if they will, if they think I'm right, that the most important thing for a playwright is to get his play done as soon after he's written it as possible. Because as you recede in time from your play, it becomes less and less you're changing, and the play and you are beginning to go in this direction. And this business of having to wait 1 or 2 years for production after you have written your play, I think it's one of the most deadly things to happen to playwrights.
Well, but there's a plus there if you're willing to go back and work, which is that after a period of time, you get some perspective on it, and you can go back and begin to treat it. Your inspiration is dead, right? But you can begin to treat it like a craftsman and begin to put it together, look at it disinterestedly. Fathers and Sons, which we're doing now at the Public Theater, I wrote 3 years ago. We were going to do it, and then I didn't touch it for 3 years, and Bob and I picked it up and started working on it this summer. I rewrote it. I didn't change the play. It's still the same play. But it's better because tighter, because sharper, because of some vantage I have on it now that I didn't have when I wrote it. What I'm saying is I'm quarreling with you, Henry.
Yes, well, not really, though, because I think I would agree that you can go back to a work. Furthermore, I once was interviewing T.S. Eliot, and I asked him about, we were talking about the cocktail party, and he said, when I got to the end of the cocktail party, writing it, he said, I felt that I couldn't do any more work on it, and he said, I put it aside, and then I went back to it, and when I rewrote it by changing the first act to agree with what I'd done at the end. And I think many playwrights, as a play changes, that they get better as it goes along, and by the time they get to the end of the play, they almost have forgotten what the beginning was like. And the usual improvement in a play, to my mind, is not changing the ending, but it's changing the beginning to help the ending make more sense. You agree with that?
Yeah. We're not quarreling anymore.
Right. We have another question.
Thank you. This might be an innocent, pertinent or impertinent inquiry, but I want to assume another role, say as a personality of Robert Wilson. And then my inquiry goes further, that I have a situation where you seem to be oblivious of who I am. And then I want to go further and suggest that maybe you're not oblivious who I am if I say hello. And so I'm saying hello and finding out where I am. So I'm interested in finding out if you're available to me.
Me or the...
Yes, this has to do with this whole seminar. I just attended lately, and I'm on time, I seem to think, because I'm here. So I'm saying that the personality of Robert Wilson, who I am at this moment, I don't know.
I mean, that's the kind of work you want to do?
That's the kind of work I think I'm doing.
Yes.
Right.
And are you in production at the moment?
I don't know who I came to a strange city. I came to a strange, I'm saying I'm an immigrant. And so therefore I want to know who, how do you say hello to the natives here?
You leave your name with Bill Riley at the theater wing desk, but that's
I think that was
I mean, am I acceptable as an immigrant coming to a native and saying hello? I want to produce.
Of course, you're acceptable, and I think the theater is acceptable to. I mean, accepts with delight.
Meaning you're willing to
anyone who wants to
this personality.
I think that was answered by many times on the panel when people had questions were asked such as that. Well, how do I get to know somebody? And they said, you now know me. You've seen me on the panel. Come and talk to me.
Yeah, but you're asking a very special question.
Yes, it is, because Robert Wilson is a special personality who might not go along with who the natives might not go along with the immigrant.
But if you would look at how Robert Wilson got started, you might find a pattern that was useful for you. And I think that it involves creating a studio. He started something called the Bert Hoffman Foundation. He raised enough money to keep a very minimal operation together with a studio in which to work. And eventually, when he had something to show, he showed it. And unfortunately, most of the people who give grants don't give grants to people who have not been organized for 2 years, so that you have to plow in the first 2 years of getting started before you can get substantial grants from NEA and people like that. However, Joe has given space to people like Mabou Mines and so on.
They're in residence, yes.
Yeah.
Robert Wilson also.
And Robert Wilson too. So I'm sure that if you have something to show Joe in your studio, that he would look at it and then tell you how far away you are from getting some space at the Public Theater.
Great, and all I have to do is to locate Mr. Ryan. Is that correct?
Mr.
Well,
Ryan.
we'll find out
Right.
right after the seminars. We'll see you.
There's another question out here.
Yes, I have a question to Bob and to Tom. How do you work, Bob, in developing a character? From an actor's point of view, how do you color a character? Like what are like the beginning steps? And then when you bring the play to have it produced or to have it worked with, Tom, do you also add into the character development?
I think you're asking
I'm asking
questions in reverse. I think
well,
you should be asking Tom the first question.
Yes,
Well,
right. That's.
If I understand what you're asking of me, the script exists before we go into rehearsal. In rehearsal, things happen that are very interesting, and the people doing the parts feed it. And because of what they're doing, I make changes. And because of what the vision that Bob has of how that action should go together, what those people should be, and because of the incredible, I've been very fortunate, creative effort of the actors I've worked with, I have actually reshaped whole sections because they gave me back more than I imagined.
I see.
Do you want to add to that?
No, I just want to say that I've worked in situations with Tom where he has actually rewritten speeches because of the personality of the actor playing the role. When he feels that the character and the actor have so merged that he begins to hear that character speaking through that actor's mouth, he's actually gone back and rewritten speeches.
So you take like the personality of the actor and color it with some of his behavior.
Well, his creative contribution is as important as anything we do in creating that character. When we were working on Fathers and Sons, something started to happen when Richard Chamberlain started to become Wild Bill Hickok. I mean, he became Wild Bill Hickok, and he knows more about it than I do right now. So when he says to me rather tentatively, could we do this, I listen.
Okay, thank you.
Gail, do you have any problem making cast changes in workshop, or do you feel that once you have selected a cast that you are more or less committed to that cast no matter what?
Well, it depends what the future life of the play is. We generally stay with the cast in a workshop production. If there are problems with the casting, and sometimes casting is incorrect, we convert to a full production, want to run it, we'll likely to consider making a change where it's needed.
Do you have a question here?
Yeah. We've been talking a lot, or you've been talking about the economic problems in the theater, and it also seems to me that the market is really glutted here. And I guess I just have a big question that I don't know if there's any answer to, but what is the market for live theater? I mean, what is it going to be as the days go by? I mean, I guess we're now like number 3 after television and film, and is it going to stay alive? I mean, we were talking about you have to either be in a house the size of King and I and make money, or you go 4 weeks at the Public Theater and don't make money, and what's going to happen to all that?
That's a good question. What we need are intermediate-sized spaces. In essence, there's very little off-Broadway left, and it's generally not too viable commercially, except for certain kinds of work. We need an intermediate house. For instance, the festival needs such a house, where we could run plays that are clearly not meant for Broadway, would not command a Broadway audience, but would command, say, an audience of, would fill an 800-seat house, and where certain plays can have a decent run, and many, many people can see them. Right now, we don't have an intermediate situation in New York of that sort, and it's a shame that we don't, because many things are missed and go by the boards, and they should have a decent run and be seen by a good many people. But there just isn't a place that exists of that sort right now. We're trying to find one.
Thank you.
Now, when Joe ran Lincoln Center, it seems to me that he had a place that, if he could have obtained a sufficient subscription audience that would be willing to go to see any 4 plays that he thought were worth seeing, that it would have been a wonderful place for this kind of play to go. For instance, the last Black Picture Show, was it?
Yes, we did that there.
And there were plays that were done at the Beaumont, which are obviously not going to be popular with large audiences, and yet I think that they should have been able to fill that house for 6 weeks, if you could have got the subscription for it.
Well, the overhead there at Lincoln Center is fantastic for all of the different houses.
You have to pay for part of the plaza upkeep, and there are other overhead expenses there. They're just enormous, which is one reason that there are no commercial producers attracted to the space now that it's dark.
Jane Alexander was here on the performance seminar, and she said that her husband is Ed Sharon, the director who's directing Semmelweis by Howard Sackler, which got good notices in Washington, but was closed because the producer didn't think it was going to be commercially feasible for Broadway. They're trying to raise money to get it to Broadway, but it's the kind of show that I think would probably go very well if it could come somewhere and run for a limited engagement for a pre-guaranteed audience. And maybe the Lincoln Center expenses make Lincoln Center not the place to do it, but there should be a place that like that where you could run 6 weeks and not be considered a failure.
That's right.
But it would have to be subsidized.
It would have to be subsidized.
Gene, you can arrange that, can't you?
Yeah, well, I can try.
Gene used to be on the NEA. Are you still on the NEA?
No, but I was for 8 years.
Henry, I'd like to take just a segue on market. It's not just the original place where it's done, whether it's off-Broadway or Broadway, but there are other markets. Once a play gets exposed, it can be published by Samuel French. It can be published in an anthology. It can be translated into various foreign languages and produced abroad. It can have a bus and truck tour or a first-class tour or a sit-down production. So the market isn't just New York. It's much broader and much more attractive than that.
You would be also amazed at the European market.
It's very large.
In Germany, I was visiting the theaters there, and they were doing shows that nobody would produce here, but they had these little theaters that were subsidized, and they would do almost anything that was of any originality or interest. And
I was just telling Bob that I just heard about a Dutch production of Prayer for My Daughter that's coming up in Dutch.
And that's exciting, and it's expansive for the author. And don't forget, too, once you've got a play script, it can be televised. It may be a potential motion picture. So the market isn't just the theater. Once you have a literary property, it's a property with all kinds of adherent rights to it, and it can go other places besides just to the festival or just to Broadway. That's
What
not
is a literary
necessarily the
property? What is involved in having that literary property? What is the first step?
copyright. Make
Okay.
sure you own it.
Costs $10. It's the best bargain for the federal government that exists.
we have time for one more question.
This is a question for Mr. Babe, just on a writing aspect. I saw A Prayer for My Daughter, and I don't know if you'll agree with what I'm saying, but still just take it on this way. Or I would say you have a wonderful mixture of poetic writing and naturalistic. You know, it's hard to find these days. I'm not sure if you want to think of it in those terms. But still, say like the scene between the rougher younger man interrogating the other younger person that was arrested. It seems like sometimes it launches from naturalism into poetry, in a way. If you would look at it that way, would you tell me how that works for you, what decisions you make, and where you kind of make those choices, if you feel you are? Or just talk about language.
You know, once you tell him that he's poetic dramatist, he's not going to be able to write anymore.
No.
I don't think he'd be worried about that. There was too much natural in it. I mean, I don't think he had that problem. It's not so.
Yeah, you may consider that a strength, but I get a lot of flack for it. People say you can't do that. You can't have people sit around the station house and use four-letter words and then take off on flights. But if I can't do that, I don't want to be in the theater.
Well, I think you do it very well, but at times it did get the play a little bit of in trouble, but it seems that if you keep going that way, you're going to write one that won't. So I just want to know where you make the decision. It's not conscious. I'm conscious of what I'm doing after I've done it. Otherwise, it's paralyzing to say, now I'm going to be good, and now I'm going to lay off, you know. You do it, and then the hard work comes going back, I think, and putting it together. Because a first draft, for me, is really a first draft, and there's a lot of raw material in it. It's what Bob was saying about first time he read prayer. There's a lot in there. There was a lot in there that nobody ever saw, just disappeared. There's a lot there now that wasn't there to start with. But I just took off on an inspiration. And it made no sense, finally, structurally. We just had to go back and craft it. And I'm not conscious of the choices I make along the line. I have to go back and rediscover why I did it in order to work on it. It's really a two-step thing. You write it and then you work on it. And that's how I work.
Yes, I think writers tend to, it would be impossible to, or at least be very painful to write if you wrote one line and then looked at it and said, now, is that right, or is that, and then decided whether it was worth going on to write another line. You have to write out of some kind of arrogance and some kind of feeling that what you're writing is coming out, and for better or worse, it's yours. And then after it's out, then you can apply some of these corrections which might make it. When I say work, you know, in the old days, when Gene and I were around,
where are you now?
we used to we used to always talk about, critics would always talk about plays about, well, the second act doesn't work, or the ending doesn't work, and so on. And the idea was that if this play was a little bit better crafted somehow, that it would then become the difference between a failure and a success. And I think that the recent history of playwriting is that just as painters are not required to go back and put a little tree in because somebody wants it, that the playwright that we're recognizing that this is what the playwright has to say, and he said it the best he can, and that to impose a condition on it that send people out of the theater electrified is not really conducive to the best quality of work from the playwright. And so I think that we're all learning to suffer whatever lack of shape that some of these plays have in order to get the reward of something better. And as I say, Shakespeare we now regard as better than Dryden, and Dryden's plays were much neater.
Well, yes, and Shakespeare is considered very messy and in the age that came after him, he was considered to be a primitive.
Well, Joe had to rewrite him in his Hamlet, remember?
There was, I just want to say I remember reading an interview with William Faulkner once in which he said he wrote The Sound and the Fury because he had an image of a little girl up a tree with muddy drawers. And that's what he wanted to get. He wanted to justify that image in his mind. And my idea is to get one thing and everything tends toward it. That's why I don't worry about one line. I worry about the one thing.
It's interesting you bring that up because I was talking to Faulkner about Sound and the Fury one time, and I said to him, and he said, I could write it so much better now than I could when I originally wrote it. But that doesn't mean that what he wrote now would be as good as what he wrote originally.
Right. On that note, I'm sorry I'm going to have to cut this short. There is so much more that we want to say, and I'm sure that you have to say here. But we have to finish. This has been an American Theatre Wing seminar, one of a series of programs that's coming to you from the Graduate Center of the University of New York. The seminar today was on the Playscript. I can't thank all of you enough for sharing your talents and your knowledge with us and with the audience. This is just one of the programs of the American Theater Wing. We do many more things during the year than the known Tony Awards, which incidentally were established in the honor of Antoinette Perry, a woman who believed in work and quality. The Tony Awards were established not for the best of anything, but for having achieved a degree of excellence in their creative field. And I think on this panel we have people here who have achieved that degree and are helping others to achieve it as well. Thank you very, very much for coming.
The first and the 20th.